Oprah mocked Bernie Sanders' faith on live TV. His response left her speechless. The Harpo studio stage gleamed beneath the blinding glow of studio lights, its polished floors and velvet chairs radiating a calculated elegance. At the center sat Oprah Winfrey, media mogul, cultural icon, a woman whose presence commanded attention. She was hosting a much-anticipated special titled Spirituality in the New Age, a glitzy showcase featuring motivational speakers, religious voices, and high-profile influencers. The audience buzzed with energy, applauding as the cameras began their live broadcast to millions. But beneath Oprah's gracious demeanor and well-practiced charm was a quiet agenda, crafted in meetings with her producers to publicly probe and perhaps undermine the personal faith of her guest, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. With her media acumen and sharp questioning, Oprah believed she could corner Bernie, a man known for his uncompromising principles, democratic socialism, and direct, sometimes fiery honesty, and gently embarrass him in front of the nation. What she didn't know was that this very moment would veer in a direction she couldn't have foreseen. As Bernie Sanders walked onto the stage, he brought with him a grounded presence. His classic rumpled suit, slightly loose at the shoulders, betrayed no effort at polish, and that was precisely the point. Bernie wasn't a man for theatrics. Tucked inside his coat was a worn copy of the Torah. Nothing ornamental, just a private reminder of his lifelong values. The audience clapped politely, though the atmosphere tensed, half curious, half bracing for conflict. This was Bernie Sanders, plain-spoken, relentlessly passionate, and unafraid to speak hard truths about faith, justice, and society, even when they weren't popular. Oprah greeted him with her usual warmth, a dazzling smile that veiled strategic intent. "Senator Sanders, it's an honor to have you here today," she said, her voice rich and poised. "We're looking forward to a conversation about spirituality, hope, and what guides us in life." Bernie offered a brief, earnest nod. "Thank you, Oprah. Glad to be here," he replied in his signature Brooklyn-accented gravel, his tone plain but deeply sincere. He eased into his chair, hands folded, posture slightly slouched in that familiar, unbothered way of his, but his eyes were sharp. He knew this wouldn't be a casual chat. He was well aware of Oprah's ventures into spiritual branding, master classes, courses, best-selling philosophies, and how much of it commodified ancient teachings into digestible entertainment. But Bernie hadn't come to pass judgment. He had come prepared to speak truth. Before the taping, he'd taken a quiet walk, reflecting, not praying in the traditional sense, but connecting with what he often called a moral responsibility to others. This wasn't about scoring political points. It was about conviction. Oprah began softly, asking about his Senate work, his relationship with working-class Vermonters, and the deep divisions plaguing American discourse. Bernie answered plainly, sometimes with fire, sometimes with humor. He spoke of the people, postal workers, students buried in debt, nurses fighting for better wages. It was the language of the grassroots. The room responded with warmth, but Oprah hadn't brought him here for anecdotes. She shifted her tone subtly, her smile still present, but her eyes narrowing like a lawyer moving in for the cross. "Senator," she said evenly, "you've often mentioned your Jewish faith, your moral roots, and your belief in economic justice as a kind of spiritual duty. But in such a diverse world, where people find truth in many forms, don't you think insisting on one tradition or one path is a little outdated?" Her words cut with surgical precision, aimed not just at Bernie's belief system, but at the boldness with which he spoke it. The studio air thinned, the audience hushed. All eyes turned to Bernie, waiting for the counterpunch. In an age that championed pluralism and inclusivity, Oprah's question struck a cultural nerve. The suggestion that one worldview could carry moral clarity over others felt, to many, like a provocation. But Bernie didn't flinch, even in his wrinkled suit. Oprah knew this, and she was banking on it. She expected Bernie Sanders to either defend his deeply held beliefs and come off as rigid and out of touch, or to backpedal and water them down, thereby undermining his own authenticity. It was a rhetorical trap, and she felt sure she had laid it perfectly. But Bernie didn't blink. He met Oprah's eyes directly, then turned to the audience, his gaze earnest, focused, and familiar to anyone who'd ever watched him speak at a rally in a windy Vermont field. There was something in his face, worn yet alive, that made people listen. "Oprah," he began, his voice gritty but deliberate, "let me tell you about a woman named Maria from Burlington." The room fell silent. "She's a home health aide, single mother, lost her husband to an opioid overdose. She's raising 2 kids, one of them with special needs, working 12-hour shifts and still can't afford rent. But every day, she gets up, makes oatmeal, takes the bus, and keeps going. When I asked her how she does it, she said, 'Because I believe this struggle means something, that there's a purpose to the pain, and I believe in something bigger than myself, in a God who sees me.'" The words landed like quiet thunder. This wasn't a politician quoting scripture or preaching ideology. This was Bernie Sanders invoking the human condition. The audience, used to neatly packaged philosophies or spiritual buzzwords, felt the grit beneath the story. Some wiped their eyes quietly. It was raw and real. Oprah, still poised and smiling, hadn't expected that. She had prepared for a head-on collision of ideas, not for a story that grounded faith in poverty and perseverance. She stepped in, trying to redirect the conversation back to more abstract, universal terms. "That's a moving story, Senator," she said with a gentle, almost patronizing cadence, as if tidying up a tangent. "But my question wasn't about individual experience. I'm asking whether your belief, your framing of moral clarity, might be inappropriate in a society where people have the right to choose their own spiritual and philosophical paths." Her voice was more pointed now, the stakes sharpened. A few audience members murmured in agreement. After all, Oprah had spent decades nurturing a brand of inclusive, choose-your-own-truth spirituality that had mainstreamed meditation, mindfulness, and the marketable pursuit of inner peace. And Bernie, with his unwavering worldview rooted in justice, ethics, and hard lines about right and wrong, stood apart from that. But still, he didn't react defensively. He nodded, recognizing the depth of the question, and leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with iron. "Oprah," he said, "I'm not here to tell people what to believe. This is not about imposing anything. That's not democracy. That's not who I am." He adjusted his posture slightly, hands open now. "But when you ask me about what grounds me, what guides me, it's this belief that there is truth, that some things are not just opinions, that justice, dignity, compassion, these are not relative. They're rooted. And yes, I believe in a moral framework that says we are all responsible for each other, not just spiritually, but practically, economically, socially." He took a beat. "You don't have to believe in God the way I do, but I can't pretend that all roads lead to the same place, just to make everyone comfortable. If I think something is true, deeply, urgently true, it would be wrong not to say it. I'm not here to coerce. I'm here to be honest." The room went still, not out of tension, but reverence. Soft claps broke out across the crowd. Not from those who necessarily agreed, but from those who respected the courage of conviction. Bernie hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His plain-spoken honesty carried weight far beyond volume. For the first time, Oprah felt the balance of power shift. She had come prepared to steer the conversation toward her polished vision of spiritual inclusivity, a vision that could be branded, sold, and repackaged for self-improvement seminars. But Bernie, with his gravel-voiced sincerity and deep-rooted ethics, had dragged the dialogue into more dangerous, more meaningful territory. Sensing her grip slipping, she went sharper. "Senator," she said, her tone tightening. "You talk about moral absolutes and frameworks of truth, but do you honestly believe that billions of people around the world, Muslims, Hindus, atheists, are simply wrong? Doesn't that make your position, well, judgmental?" It was a rhetorical grenade. If Bernie said yes, he'd be accused of arrogance. If he said no, he'd seem to contradict his own beliefs. The audience held its collective breath. Oprah had asked the perfect trap. She was the face of open-hearted reason, the cultural authority they trusted to root out narrowness, to sniff out hypocrisy. Bernie paused, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to say it right. He closed his eyes for a second, not in prayer, but in the way a man does when drawing from a lifetime of protest lines, picket signs, and unshakable conviction. Then Bernie Sanders looked at Oprah, his gaze steady, serious, and unmistakably kind. "Oprah," he said, voice gravelly and calm, "truth doesn't bend just because more people disagree with it, and it sure doesn't bend to make everyone feel comfortable." His tone held no contempt, just unshakable conviction. "If I see a bridge is broken, I'm not going to tell people to go walking across it just because they believe it's safe. That's not compassion, that's negligence. My beliefs, my faith, if you want to call it that, it's not about judgment. It's about responsibility. It's about warning people, standing up, and offering some kind of hope." He paused briefly, letting his words hang in the air. "I'm not standing here saying that everyone who disagrees with me is wrong because they're different. I'm saying I've walked a long road, seen some dark places, and I've come to believe deeply in a set of principles that matter. And I'm going to share them with anyone who will listen." The analogy was simple, but devastating. It wasn't abstract. It was Sanders in his purest form, direct, unvarnished, and driven by what he saw as a moral obligation to speak plainly. Scattered applause broke out across the room. Some clapped softly, unsure. Others did so with fervor, moved not just by his words, but by the raw sincerity in his voice. Even those who disagreed found it hard to deny the force of his integrity. Oprah's smile tightened. The poise was still there, but the edges had begun to fray. She hadn't expected this, a politician who refused to play the game. Bernie wasn't dodging, deflecting, or shifting blame. He was leaning into the fire with humility and conviction. "That's an interesting perspective, Senator," she said carefully, her voice holding a thread of strain beneath the practiced elegance. "We'll explore this more deeply after a quick break." As the lights dimmed and the show cut to commercial, Oprah glanced toward Bernie. Her eyes flickered, part frustration, part reluctant admiration. She knew that the next segment would be more intense, and for the first time in her long, calculated career, she wasn't sure she would come out on top. Bernie, meanwhile, sat quietly, his gaze drifting toward the audience. His hand rested on his knee. His heart, though not religious in the conventional sense, was reaching for something higher, a silent resolve, a whisper of purpose. The battle wasn't over, and what came next might change everything. The lights at Harpo Studios flared back on, bathing the set in warm gold. The audience, still humming with tension from the last segment, sat upright in their seats, all eyes now fixed on Oprah Winfrey and Senator Bernie Sanders. What had started as a glossy special on New Age spirituality had twisted into something else entirely. A visceral collision of worldviews, more reckoning than conversation. Oprah, her polished composure shaken by Bernie's stark sincerity, knew she had to regain control. She had built an empire by guiding the narrative, steering guests gently but firmly toward a message that was marketable, inclusive, and emotionally safe. But Sanders, with his unapologetic moral compass and refusal to dilute his principles, was proving immovable. The cameras rolled. Oprah leaned in. Her voice, though wrapped in velvet, had taken on a cutting edge. "Welcome back, everyone," she said. "We're here with Senator Bernie Sanders. talking about faith, truth, and the search for meaning in today's complex world. She gave the audience a moment to process, to center her authority in the room again. "Senator, you've shared some powerful personal convictions, and I appreciate your candor," she said. Tone still smooth, but now tactical. She paused. "But let's talk real for a moment," she said, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You've used your beliefs, your deep moral stance, to connect with voters, to present yourself as a man of principle. Some would say that's a form of emotional leverage, that it's a way to manipulate people into trusting you. What do you say to that?" The words were lobbed like a grenade, designed to plant doubt, to blur the line between conviction and political performance. A murmur swept through the audience. The question cut deep. Accusations of exploiting faith or values for political gain were as old as politics itself. Oprah was counting on Bernie to fumble, to get defensive or pivot awkwardly. The camera zoomed in. Bernie didn't blink. Instead, he slowly reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small, creased piece of paper, clearly handled many times. He held it up briefly, not for effect, but as if it reminded him why he was there. Then he placed it gently on his knee. "Oprah," he began, his voice steady and low, "let me tell you about a boy named Tommy from New Orleans." The audience leaned in. The pivot had caught them off guard. Bernie's tone softened, but his words gripped the room like a hand on your shoulder. "Tommy's 10 years old," he said, "and he's spent more time in hospitals than playgrounds. He's got a condition that makes his bones fragile. Can't run, can't fall without risking a break. His mother works 2 jobs just to pay for his treatments. Leukemia." Bernie said it plainly. No drama, no theatrics, just truth. "His mother wrote me a letter not too long ago," he continued, eyes softening as they scanned the audience. "She said her boy, Tommy, watched one of my speeches on TV. I had talked about justice, about how even when the world feels like it's falling apart, there's still a reason to hope, still something worth fighting for." He paused, then added, voice low but thick with emotion, "She said Tommy grabbed her hand and said, 'Mama, if that man says I matter, I'm not scared anymore.'" Bernie paused again, this time not for impact, but because he wanted people to feel it, really feel it. "I didn't tell that story to win votes, Oprah," he said firmly. "I told it because kids like Tommy, and folks like his mom, they need to believe that someone sees them, that their pain matters, that there's a future worth surviving for." He glanced at the crumpled piece of paper still resting on his knee. "My beliefs, they're not tools, they're not props. They're why I get up every day. They're the reason I fight for health care, for justice, for dignity. Not because it polls well, but because it's right." The studio fell into a deep hush. Bernie's words had settled like a heavy blanket across the room. A few in the audience wiped away tears. Others nodded slowly, as if Tommy's story had opened something tender inside them. Oprah, caught off guard, felt a ripple of unease. She'd expected policy talk, ideological skirmishes, not something this intimate, this raw. Her brand had always been about storytelling, about drawing emotion from truth. But this wasn't the polished, elegant kind of emotion she controlled. This was messy, unfiltered, real. She regrouped quickly. "That's a powerful story, Senator," she said, her voice even but touched with strain. "And I don't doubt that it resonates with a lot of people." She straightened in her chair. "But let's broaden the lens," she said, slipping back into her familiar rhythm. "You speak about this sense of moral truth with such certainty, but don't you think that's limiting in a global society? There are people all over the world finding peace in different ways. Buddhism, meditation, indigenous traditions. Can we really say there's only one answer?" It was a strategic pivot, pulling the discussion back to abstract ideals, where Oprah's universalist message thrived. Her empire, after all, was built on the notion that all paths lead to healing if they're walked sincerely. Bernie's moral absolutism clashed with that vision, And now she was aiming to highlight that divide. The audience murmured in approval. A few heads nodded, but Bernie didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, clasped his hands, and looked at Oprah. Not with condescension, but with grounded, unwavering compassion. "Oprah," he said, "I respect that people find meaning in many ways. I do. I'm not here to tell anyone they can't search. Search all you want, but let me ask you something." He leaned forward now, his voice sharpening, not angry, just fiercely clear. "If a child is about to walk into a burning building, do you tell them there are lots of doors? Or do you point them to the one exit you know leads to safety?" The room reacted instantly. Gasps, soft claps, stunned silence. The metaphor hit hard. It wasn't an attack on other beliefs. It was urgency. It was clarity. It was Bernie Sanders being Bernie Sanders, challenging comfort with conviction. Oprah's smile flickered, just for a second. She hadn't expected the question to be thrown back at her with such force. And the audience's reaction, scattered applause, murmurs of agreement, told her she was starting to lose control. "That's a vivid metaphor, Senator," she replied tightly. "But you're sidestepping something important. My work, my courses, my books have helped millions of people find peace, healing, and purpose. Are you saying that's meaningless, just because it doesn't come from your framework?" It was a trap, designed to make Bernie either alienate her followers or dilute his message. The crowd leaned forward, aware this was a crucial moment. Bernie paused, not because he was unsure, but because he cared about getting it right. He looked at Oprah, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't judgment, but something far more disarming: compassion. "Oprah," he said gently, "I don't doubt you've helped a lot of people feel better. And that matters. It really does. Encouragement, kindness, those things go a long way." He let that sit for a beat. But feeling better isn't the same as being changed. It's not the same as justice, or truth, or real, lasting peace. Your courses may ease the pain, but they don't answer the deeper questions. Why are we here? What's the purpose of all this suffering? He straightened slightly, voice calm but resolute. "My beliefs tell me there is a bigger answer, that there's a moral arc to the universe, not just feel-good spirituality, and I'd be lying if I said I thought every path leads to that." The studio went quiet, the kind of silence that feels sacred, not from offense, not from shock, but from depth. Bernie hadn't attacked, he had simply stood firm. The audience, many of whom had spent thousands on Oprah's miracle mindset seminars, empowerment retreats, and best-selling self-help courses, began to feel something shift. They had been promised peace, abundance, alignment. But Bernie Sanders was offering something else, something you couldn't buy, something raw, weighty, and demanding. And suddenly, Oprah felt it too. For the first time in her career, she felt exposed. Her empire thrived on the belief that spirituality could be beautifully packaged, marketed for growth, healing, and personal transformation. But Bernie's beliefs didn't fit that model. His truth wasn't polished. It was unyielding, even inconvenient. And it didn't cost money. It cost comfort. She rallied, her voice rising slightly as she leaned in. "Senator, you're talking about your beliefs as if salvation, as you call it, is exclusive to your worldview," she said, her tone now sharper. "But what about the wisdom of other traditions? The billions of people around the world who find meaning, joy, and transcendence in paths outside of yours? Are they just wrong?" The audience clapped, more forcefully this time. Encouraged, she was their voice, the woman who had taught them to trust themselves, to embrace all paths, all lights, all inner divinities. And here was Bernie Sanders, stoic, immovable, seemingly reducing that mosaic of belief into a single, rigid truth. But Bernie didn't backpedal. He reached for the now familiar, folded piece of paper on his knee and held it, not like a prop, but like something sacred. "Oprah," he said, his voice calm but resolute, I'm not here to tell the world who's right and who's wrong. That's not the point. I'm here to tell you what I've seen, what I know. He looked out over the crowd, then back at her. When I was young, I looked for meaning everywhere. Books, politics, philosophy. I studied Marx. I studied Gandhi. I read every thinker I could find. But nothing filled the void. Nothing settled the restlessness inside me. He leaned forward now, voice low and urgent. And then I encountered something I hadn't expected. Not an ideology, not a program, but a call. A voice that said, "Come to me, and I will give you rest." That wasn't religion. That was something real. And it changed everything. He shook his head softly, not in doubt, but in awe. That's not arrogance. That's surrender. I'm not here to argue. I'm just a man who was drowning and found a lifeline. And now I'm trying to throw it to anyone else who's sinking. The words hit like a wave. The crowd inhaled. Some clapped. Others sat completely still, visibly shaken. What Bernie was offering wasn't certainty dressed up in dogma. It was testimony. And that difference was electric. Oprah's fingers tightened on the armrests of her chair. Her facade, polished by decades of interviews and inner peace branding, showed its first visible crack. She had spent years building an empire on a version of truth that made people feel empowered. Bernie's message wasn't empowering. It was disarming. His truth couldn't be marketed. It couldn't be sold. And the audience, they were no longer just watching her. They were watching him. She felt the shift, and she knew it. Desperate to regain control, she struck with a final question. "Senator," she said sharply, "your faith is clearly important to you. But let's be real. You're a public figure, a man with power and influence. When you talk about this idea that only your path is true, you're shaping how people think, how they vote, how they live. Isn't that dangerous? Isn't that a form of control?" The accusation was surgical. She was no longer questioning his beliefs. She was questioning his influence, framing his convictions as a threat, something manipulative. The audience stirred, some nodding, some waiting to see how he'd respond. Bernie looked at her, and his expression was steady, gentle, almost sorrowful. "Oprah," he said slowly, "power's a strange thing. You can use it to build a bigger stage for yourself, or to lift someone off the ground." He held the paper again. The corners were frayed. "My faith, it's not about control. It's about freedom. Freedom from fear, from shame, from chasing things that never satisfy." He glanced out into the crowd. "I talk about Jesus, not to convert the masses or win an election, but because I've seen what that name does for people like Tommy, like Maria, like me." He held the letter up, his voice now barely above a whisper, but it carried through the studio like thunder. "This is from Tommy's mom. Sent it last week, thanking me, not for policy, not for a check, but for giving her boy hope." He folded it gently and tucked it back into his pocket. "That's why I'm here, Oprah. Not to win an argument, but to point people to someone who can carry them when no one else can." The studio erupted, not with polite TV-friendly clapping, but with raw emotion. Some people were weeping, others stood. Whispers of prayer flickered through the room like wind through trees. And Oprah? She sat motionless. Not from offense, but from realization. She wasn't just losing the debate. She was losing the room. Bernie Sanders, gruff, unflashy, unwavering, had pierced deeper than her empire ever had. The show cut to a break. She turned toward him, eyes reflecting something new. Not just defeat, but respect. And maybe, just maybe, a hint of awakening. Bernie, meanwhile, adjusted his coat, his hand resting calmly on his heart, the letter safely back in his pocket. The battle wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. As the final segment of the Spirituality in the New Age special began, Harpo Studios felt less like a television set and more like a sacred space. The lights glowed softly, but it was the silence that carried the most weight. A heavy, reflective hush filled with questions too big for sound. The audience sat motionless, still reeling from the emotional force of Senator Bernie Sanders's words. Their eyes flickered between him and Oprah Winfrey. What had begun as a sleek, high-production talk show had transformed into something else entirely. A confrontation of souls, not egos. A reckoning, not a discussion. Oprah, known for her unshakable composure and decades of narrative control, sat at a crossroad. She could tighten her grip and redirect the conversation back to comfort, or she could lean into the discomfort rising inside her. Something she hadn't felt on camera in years. The cameras rolled. But the real tension now lived between the lines, in the pauses, in the eye contact, in the vulnerability that was no longer feigned. Bernie Sanders, his suit slightly wrinkled, his hands folded gently on his lap, sat with a kind of peace that wasn't passive, but grounded. The letter from Tommy's mother still rested, folded, in his pocket. He wasn't here to win. He was here to tell the truth, no matter what it cost. Oprah inhaled deeply. Her hands were clasped tightly, the way someone does when trying to hold themselves together. "Senator Sanders," she began, her voice noticeably softer now. Gone was the edge, the performance. You've given us a lot to think about. Your conviction, your stories, they're powerful." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "But I need to understand something." She looked at him now, not as a host, not as an authority, but as a seeker. "How can you be so certain that your path, your truth, is the only one? I've spent my life helping people, through all kinds of ways. Meditation, self-discovery, ancient practices. Are you saying all of that was wrong?" The question wasn't strategic this time. It was real, raw, a plea. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Oprah Winfrey, the indomitable queen of connection, was showing a crack in her foundation, and millions were watching it happen live. Bernie's eyes softened, but his gaze stayed locked. He reached for the letter from his pocket, not to show it, but to feel it, to stay grounded. "Oprah," he said, his voice low and textured, like gravel beneath running water. "I'm not here to tear anything down, and I'm not saying every other path is meaningless. I'm just saying I found one that's true." He leaned in slightly, his words careful, but urgent. "Not because I'm better, not because I figured it out, but because, frankly, it found me. I wasn't searching for a system. I wasn't interested in religion. I was angry, lost, looking for meaning in justice, in protest, in revolution. But none of that filled the ache." He gestured subtly to his chest. "And then something, or someone, met me right there. Broken, skeptical, tired. It wasn't a theory. It wasn't a philosophy. It was a lifeline. And it changed me." He looked her in the eyes. "You've helped people find peace, and that's something. But peace that fades when the course ends or the book closes, it's not enough. What we need is hope that lasts, and I believe only Jesus gives that." The studio was silent, but full. The kind of silence that vibrated. Some nodded slowly. A few wiped their eyes. Others looked down, absorbing something they couldn't yet name. Oprah's hands trembled ever so slightly. Her mind was racing, turning over years of affirmations, masterclasses, best-selling frameworks. She had made millions teaching people to look inward for salvation. But Bernie's words weren't self-help. They were confrontation. Her lips parted, voice unsteady. "Senator, I've helped millions of people. I've watched lives transform. Are you saying that all of that doesn't matter, just because it doesn't come from your faith?" There was defensiveness in her tone, but also something deeper. A crack. A question she didn't want to ask. "What if I've been wrong?" Bernie didn't react sharply. He didn't attack. He simply smiled. Gently, quietly. A smile that didn't diminish her, but welcomed her. "Oprah," he said, "what you've done. It matters. Kindness always matters. Compassion always counts." He paused, then spoke with renewed gravity. But this isn't about whether you've helped people feel better. The real question is, have they found something that can make them whole? He looked not at her now, but through to something deeper. Jesus didn't come to make us comfortable. He came to make us new. That's the difference. His words struck like quiet thunder, not harsh, but devastating in their clarity. The audience was still. Some clapped. Others sat frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were hearing and what it meant for their own lives. And Oprah? Her face crumpled, eyes glistening, breath unsteady. For the first time, she wasn't the giver of wisdom, the source of hope. She was the seeker. She stood slowly, legs uncertain beneath her. "Senator," she began, voice breaking, "I've built my whole life on helping people." A pause. "But if I've been pointing them to the wrong thing," her throat tightened. "What does that make me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, but heard by everyone.